Thanks very much to Ram, to Tessa, to Farooq Musa, even though he's not here, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to speak both for the Islamic Renaissance Front and for University of Nottingham. I'll offer a fairly academic discussion of the theme of the politics of civil society, and I'll focus particularly on the question of the connection between civil society and democracy. So whether there's a connection between these two, what the nature of that connection might be, what we might look for in Malaysia or in the region, the Southeast Asian region more broadly, if our concern, which I think it might be, is with a pro-democratic aspect to civil society.
We can't see you.
Oh.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. It's not the first time. Oh, you know what, actually, how about this?
Yeah, better.
Okay. All right, let's try that again. I'm supposed to be in a place where I'm not excessively short, but never mind. People are often confused that I'm American because I'm not the right height, but I am. So at any rate, getting back to this, so I'll give the fairly academic, wonkish take, and then I'll leave it to our interveners, who are themselves both opinion leaders and activists rooted in the Malaysian context, to offer a more specific grounding or application of what I discuss, or whatever they'd like to talk about. Among the most commonly noted contributors to democratization and supports for successful democratic praxis is a vibrant civil society. But unfortunately, the discussion too often stops there, at the notion of an undifferentiated, frequently anthropomorphized civil society that acts as a necessary, if not sufficient, causal factor. Experience in this region of Southeast Asia offers ample grounds for teasing out the complex mechanisms actually involved, the attributes of civil society that are most germane, and what specific types of civil society organizations, organized on what bases, so class, communal segments, interests, and so on, are most likely to be germane to processes of liberalization or full democratization. My objective today is to posit what sorts of civil society organizations seem most conducive to political liberalization, to democratization, and how that effect might manifest itself, how it might appear. So first, what do we know about civil society in Southeast Asia, including in Malaysia? While attention to civil society has increased in the region since the 1980s, hang on one second. Much better. These organizations and networks are not new phenomena. By the 1920s, at least, substantial and vibrant associational life characterized much of the region, manifested most obviously in mass-based as well as more narrowly framed nationalist challenges to colonial rule, then post-colonial nation-building movements, in trade unions and in chambers of commerce and industry, in undergraduate associations on campuses, and in literary associations of various forms, for instance. Social capital, by which we mean the familiarity, bonds of reciprocity, and trust that facilitates collective action, accumulated through those initiatives, even if they were disarticulated, disconnected from formal politics, especially while those states were still under colonial rule. Some of those associations adapted or forged a modern, so-called modern niche, so emergent universities, newspapers, early political parties, and so forth. Other organizations, including many of the most significant, developed around organized religion, Catholicism in the Philippines, Islam in Malaysia and Indonesia, Buddhism in Thailand and Burma, and so forth. The church, mosque, temple, or monastery itself was significant, providing education and social functions, as well as straightforward devotional observance. Moreover, these lines of association were echoed in organizations from Burma's Young Men's Buddhist Association to Indonesia's reformist Sarekat Islam. Indeed, contrary to conceptions of civil society that are prevalent in the academic literature, that presume that vertically structured hierarchical organizations, or those that are based on ascriptive, that is assigned or inherited identities, cannot generate the sorts of social capital that characterizes more voluntaristic forms, these sorts of organizations have been and remain central to political socialization and mobilization across Southeast Asia. Further signaling the diversity of this sphere has been the range of tactics adopted. Nonviolent strategies predominated among groups seeking to shape or staff the early state, particularly where colonial authorities adopted a tutelary approach to transition, giving members of a rising professional class a reasonable expectation of political efficacy, most notably in Malaysia and Singapore. Regardless, other or some of the same associations came to adopt uncivil, violent tactics on at least an occasional basis as well. For instance, among the nationalist activists centered around Rangoon University in the pre-war period in Burma, within open as well as underground communist front organizations across the region from around the 1930s to 70s, or groups such as Thailand's Village Scout movement in the mid-1970s. Those threats and their suppression shaped the developing state itself by fostering particular configurations and mindsets vis-a-vis civil society among elites. As this range of organizational manifestations suggests, Southeast Asian civil society organizations have been implicated in all flavors of political change, and not just democratization. Indeed, even when incensed masses strike the fatal blow against authoritarianism, elites reconsolidate to determine the shape and extent of subsequent liberalization. Civil societal pressure still matters to democratic transition, consolidation, and persistence, but at most as a contributing factor, not a monolithic factor. Social mobilization may be the cause or the effect of, or may just be coincident with, liberalization. Moreover, we find viable civil societies in a range of regimes, nor is it necessarily the institutionally strongest democracies that provide the broadest space for public engagement or opposition of various forms. So how might we classify these civil societies in order to assess their political potential? Malaysian political scientist Mutaya Alagapa offers a taxonomy of regimes centered around the space and scope allowed for civil societal engagement. He divides the region's regimes into those with a legitimate civil society, as in present-day Indonesia or the Philippines, a controlled and communalized civil society, including Malaysia and Singapore, or a repressed civil society, until recently in Myanmar or in Vietnam. Civil society may reinforce formal political opposition, but it is not necessarily an accurate indicator of the latter's strength. Malaysia, for example, has more strongly institutionalized opposition parties than Singapore, but both are classified by Mutaya Alagapa as having controlled civil societies. This configuration of space helps to determine the forms and nature of citizens' engagement in public life, and hence whether and when the impetus for pro-democratic regime change is likely to come from civil society. Those states with a legitimate civil society tend to have reasonably vibrant associational life, supported by legal safeguards, including freedoms of association, speech, and the press, albeit often with some limitations. Space for political opposition may still be curtailed, or the chances of a constituency's gaining formal political power may be slim. The Philippines has arguably the region's most vibrant civil society and media, and yet political power has always been concentrated there within a narrow economic elite. Still, organizations of women, of the poor, and of other constituencies are better organized and coordinated there than elsewhere in Southeast Asia. These grassroots activists in the Philippines periodically do join people power mobilizations, but they more routinely urge what amounts to liberalization in the sense of opening policy agendas and enforcing accountability through advocacy efforts. On the other hand, shifts in the political space for civil society and formal opposition may move in tandem. Post-transition Indonesia, for instance, has seen an increase in activism among trade unions, NGOs, and the like, alongside the proliferation of political parties and the diffusion of power among those parties. In states with a communalized or controlled civil society, the electoral process is not meaningless, but the political arena and civil liberties are relatively constrained and structured around persistent social cleavages, such as ethnicity. The combination of external constraint and internal division may preclude civil societal activists from posing a systemic challenge, just as such disunity hampers effective collaboration among the formal opposition. Or it may encourage identity building along fundamentally divided, siloized lines, bolstering a regime strategy of divide and rule. Such a structure is prone to cultivate more intra-group bonding than cleavage-crossing bridging social capital. Still, lines of cleavage may change over time, however still salient, as with the emergence of rifts among Malays in Malaysia and an apparent shift from communal to religious identity frames here. Meanwhile, states with repressed civil societies may effectively silence what agitation arises, although these challenges, for instance via online media, mark potential fault lines for the state. Even when regime change ultimately comes from the top, as has been the case in Myanmar, pressure from below rallies international allies and forces a response, whether suppressing or liberalizing, from the regime. And anomalies arise regardless. Most obvious is the enduring, essentially undemocratic challenge in Thailand from royalists and opponents of the populist, corrupt Thaksin Shinawatra, who have not just unseated a sequence of elected governments, but contest the suitability of elections at all for Thailand. It is the space that Thailand allows for mobilization that has permitted this challenge to the very notion of elected government. Similarly, middle-class NGOs may serve as agents of governmentality in a Foucauldian sense, themselves disciplined by their reliance upon external funds. These NGOs and their activists discipline citizens, in turn, to accommodate themselves to neoliberal economics and particular forms of democratic politics. In short, then, we're left to conclude that civil society activism in Southeast Asia has not always favored political liberalization. Civil societies in the region may either support the regime, whether democratic or not, or they may challenge it. Even when their discourse appears liberal, the vagaries of funding, of reliance upon forbearance of the state, and of engaging in representation rather than necessarily mandating equal voice from those so represented, may convey upon the most organized of civil society organizations more of a domesticating or even reactionary than radicalizing function, even if pro-democratic organizations and rhetoric still loom large. Moreover, commonly assumed roles related to accountability, transparency, and governance may be poorly articulated. What specifically can or should an NGO do to serve as an effective check upon government? How much can or should insider strategies of working with at least a seemingly sympathetic state complement more autonomous outsider strategies? And I actually think these questions are especially germane to Malaysia today. Yet, however potentially equivocal, the regime-changing implications of civil society in Southeast Asia continue to garner attention, and for good reason. Several states in the region have experienced sustained or episodic civil society movements aimed at systemic political change just since the mid-1980s: Myanmar, Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, and of course Malaysia. The appearance and success of such movements has not been in tandem with economic development, whether following straightforward indicators of growth or reflecting entrenchment of a substantial class-identified bourgeoisie. Such a class is largely missing in Myanmar, for instance, and communally segmented in Malaysia. Nor has a degree of political liberalization in the status quo clearly indicated when mobilization might succeed. Indeed, having more space to mobilize rather than less space, comparing Malaysia under Mahathir with Indonesia under Suharto, may encourage channeling protests through less incendiary channels, including electoral contests, which may dampen the chances for far-reaching transformation. Factors ranging from differing colonial legacies to internal societal homogeneity or heterogeneity, post-colonial economic trajectories and openness, the availability of especially charismatic or competent leaders, and other factors combined with cultural ones to produce the variations in civil society and social capital that shape political forms and outcomes. Furthermore, while there may be something to common arguments regarding Asians' tendency toward deference, relaxing legal curbs on the press and association in Indonesia, for instance, yielded an outpouring of criticism in the media and on the streets. Public life in the Philippines is hardly calm and orderly, and critics in Vietnam, Myanmar, especially before 2010, and elsewhere, have been forcibly silenced, not voluntarily mute. Overall, then, the rapid growth of civil society organizations across the region since the mid-1980s has evinced different and shifting compositions, resources, goals, and formal institutionalization. These civil societies both support and challenge aspects of prevailing political systems and are themselves arenas of power, struggle, and cooperation alike. Civil society may support democracy if its dominant discourses and organizations are pro-democratic, and if opportunity structures within political society offer avenues for liberalization. So while the strengthening of civil society has limited the power and reach of the state, whether through more confrontational or more cooperative approaches, the state remains the most powerful institution across Southeast Asian politics and fundamentally shapes the development and spread of civil society. Yet the question of the relationship between civil societies and regime dynamics in the region still bears closer examination. As Australian political scientist Gary Roden explains, groups that exist outside the state have divergent values and agendas, not all of which are marked by political tolerance or liberal democracy. There is no inevitability that civil society will prove to be the most effective or common political accommodation to the pressures for change from domestic populations. Exemplifying this variety are, for instance, the Village Scouts, this mass-based group in Thailand. This was a quasi-fascist group that was initially sponsored by Thai intelligence that played an active role in a right-wing military crackdown in 1976. Or we could include within the same category Malaysia's very own explicitly Malay supremacist Perkasa, for instance. Civil society, hence, need not be a liberalizing force in Southeast Asia or elsewhere. Yet democracy requires civil society. Participation and engagement beyond electoral mechanisms are necessary but not sufficient criteria for democracy, both at the point of transition and subsequently. Regional experience suggests a far broader range of reforms beyond pressures for liberal democracy, to which civil society might contribute. Political reform in Thailand, for instance, has assumed a wide variety of meanings, from seeking democracy to technocracy, good governance, transformation of socio-political relations, or more recently, insisting on oligarchy. Likewise, we find that in Singapore, the seemingly unshakable PAP regime has co-opted and accommodated the middle class sufficiently well to stave off most strong demands for political participation and liberal values. An overriding concern with protecting one's hard-earned middle-class status, coupled with an ideological emphasis on technocratic management, has rendered the process of liberalization in Singapore more a matter of extending consultation with state-created channels than an adversarial contest. Singaporean civil society does include independent voices that contest rather than align with the state, but much of the sphere is more cautiously reformist than directly challenging. Importantly, too, to say that civil societal organizations agitate, whether through state-supporting or state-defying channels, is not to claim that they have real influence. The most obvious example is Vietnam, marked increasingly in recent years by both subtle and more aggressive efforts for land reform, civil liberties, and other goals. Space for civil society remains highly constrained, however. Vietnamese civil society organizations are not allowed to criticize Communist Party leaders or officials, the military or others, and thus cannot be unreservedly political, lest they lose what small political space they have. On the other hand, here in Malaysia, the availability of informal political space offers disillusioned or critical citizens an option beyond electoral politics, rendering the state more democratic in practice than its constraints on civil liberties and institutional autonomy might suggest. The rise of alternative media, both interactive, online social media, and outlets for so-called contentious journalism, extends these patterns by effectively expanding the public sphere, granting civil society activists more space to tell their own story and to counter dominant narratives. Yet the nature of advocacy work is such that NGO activists must engage with empowered decision makers if they hope to change policies. Such engagement not only carries risk of co-optation, but may help to strengthen the state even when it also bolsters civil society. For instance, reformist NGOs may poach members from more radically activist or even more effective grassroots-based organizations, or they may stand for, and in doing so take the pressure off, inadequately representative political parties. In so doing, these NGOs may do relatively little to expand political participation and could ultimately sap the strength of civil society. As such, NGOs or activists from them may shift policy agendas, but without a liberalizing impact upon the regime writ large. Part of the difficulty in evaluating the implications for democratization of civil society in Southeast Asia is not just the variability and mutability of civil society organization, but the framework in which these efforts occur. Prevailing definitions of civil society generally presume the sort of regime in which voluntary organizations are free to form, meet, and express critical opinions, and in which the state is not overly intrusive or coercive. in this region, civil society persists even in far less conducive environments. So on the one hand, the largely post-colonial, late developing states of Southeast Asia have embraced different forms and functions than have their Western European counterparts. It is natural that civil societies across this region would vary as well. Indeed, central to Southeast Asia's significance among studies of civil society has been the array of undemocratic regimes in the region and the range both of organizational activity found across those states and of vectors of political change, from mass protests to elite fractures and pacts to external pressure and top-down transformation. Studies of the New Order regime in Indonesia in particular offer detailed description and analysis of social mobilization under authoritarian rule, offering points of comparison not just with other Southeast Asian states, but also with Latin American bureaucratic authoritarianism and Eastern European democratization. On the other hand, Southeast Asian experience contradicts prevailing assumptions about the links between economic and political liberalization or transformation, with civil society at the crux of the issue. In particular, while conventional wisdom associates a vibrant civil society with advanced economic development, in Southeast Asia, emerging business and middle classes tend to constitute a force for moderation, prompting the narrowing of space for the political left and for independent political activity more broadly. What James Jesudasan describes as a syncretic state in Malaysia, in which power holders, quote, combine a broad array of economic, ideological, and coercive elements in managing the society, fits that pattern, as do conceptions of a mild-mannered civic society rather than civil society in Singapore and elsewhere. Similarly, in Vietnam, despite rapid economic development and an expanding middle class, the bourgeoisie seems less a force for change there than possible factions among regime elites themselves. Even amidst legal curbs, a degree of ideological hegemony, and limited chance of efficacy, however, significant voices may emerge from civil society to engage government agencies in debate. Considering their options, citizens may still determine that their best chance at influence is by working within rather than against state structures. They may, for instance in Singapore, choose to express dissent in the form of feedback to an overall effective and at least minimally consultative state rather than support either opposition political parties or adversarial NGOs. Or NGOs themselves may accept state intervention, co-optation, or patronage in the face of state power and resistance to those demands, also echoed by opposition parties, as has happened at times in Malaysia. Still, that these challenges are broached at all represents a symbolic challenge to existing political institutions and sustains a niche for non-institutional, non-electoral politics. All told, those possibilities suggest a wider range of state civil society dialectics than the liberal democratic one most common in the mainstream literature. The foregoing discussion suggests a new framework for assessing the likely or at least possible regime-changing aspects of civil society. We might think of classifying civil societies in terms of their ability or likelihood to affect political change, recognizing that such change need not be toward democracy. Three axes to this taxonomy are the collective identity behind the movement, the extent of political space, and the general inclination of elites. In the interest of time, and I hope not to take the full 45 minutes Ram has given me, I will sketch each only briefly. The first dimension to consider is the collective identity motivating activists. Far from all civil society organizations in the region accept an inclusive frame. Those that tend toward exclusiveness, moreover, may actively discourage full and equitable citizenship. In other words, a key question is whether civil societal initiatives would move society and the state toward or away from democracy in the sense of liberalizing participation, opening up participation. Movements for women's or minority rights found across the region, for instance, demonstrate inclusivity, whereas groups in a place like Malaysia focused on narrowly communal rights typify the potential for efforts to extend the state's intrusion into private life at the expense of civil liberties and to restrict rather than extend citizenship rights. Three broad, frequently overlapping categories that populate this axis are communal, including religious organizations, class-based, especially middle-class organizations, and issue-oriented organizations. Of these three broad types, organizations centered around issue advocacy seem empirically most likely to promote liberalization, at least discursively. Yet, as noted above, especially when these civil society organizations are more representational than groupings of those themselves affected, they may adopt a more reformist than radical stance. Policy advocacy may expand voice and promote gradual shifts in power relations, but might not prioritize installation of a democratic order. The premise of mobilization, moreover, tells only part of the story. The second dimension in this typology is political space, which ranges in the region from highly open to highly constrained. A common, if partial, argument for the emergence of exclusionary Islamist organizations in post-New Order Indonesia, for instance, is simply the relaxation of long-standing constraints on political mobilization. Mundane organization, let alone significant protest, is more difficult where the public sphere is closely monitored and curbed. Those constraints need not be overtly coercive. Fear of sacrificing class position or social mobility to take a political or solidaristic stand may be just as confining in practice. On the other hand, where liberal participation is allowed in the region, it tends to extend to electoral channels. In that case, mobilization may trend toward institutionally formal, electoral, rather than informal, that is, civil societal, political channels. Given the option of pursuing change from within, activists may smartly choose this path, even when simple legislative demographics indicate the slim chance of controlling policy agendas. In other words, assessment of whether liberalizing pressure is likely to come from civil society or from other vectors requires consideration of the full public sphere, including the nature of political space for electoral engagement. Lastly, not just these structural dimensions, but the agency of elites shapes the scope and content of civil societal efforts. A broad cut distinguishes among authoritarian, technocratic, and liberalizing or liberal elites. The first, authoritarian elites, are not accommodating. They will seek to suppress activism, or at least give the unequivocal impression that any useful initiatives were their own design, such that political change is likely to require fractures among those elites themselves. Technocratic elites, meanwhile, such as those prevalent in Singapore and arguably Malaysia, will likely prefer to co-opt or divide activists, such that good ideas remain on the table, but fail to pose a threat. Lastly, liberalizing or liberal elites, who may themselves come from civil societal organizations, or who may base their political legitimacy on democratic voice and accountability, are more likely to engage constructively with civil society. Together, these three dimensions trace a complex picture of who within the region's civil societies is likely to press for or resist liberalization, who might promote change in other directions besides liberalization, or who might resist liberalization, who might advance these claims, in short. Yet a tidy matrix of states and tendencies is impossible. We see a mix of patterns in each state, over sectors and over time, recommending a healthy dose of skepticism about the democratic aspirations and ability of civil society, taken in the abstract, however pivotal social mobilization may sometimes be for political liberalization. The overall picture that emerges is a pessimistic one for those otherwise inclined to presume a necessary link between civil society and democracy. Rather, Southeast Asian experience recommends careful consideration of the collective identities at the heart of mobilization, the space allowed for both formal and informal participation, and the specific nature of political elites in assessing or predicting the scope and direction of civil society as a political force. I'll stop there, and rather than bore you by using all my time, and leave things now to the moderator and our two interveners. Thanks.